But you all like my students.
Must be
Why don't you
Jimmy
move
Carr.
up here?
Look at what the cat dragged in. Did you remember how to get here? Wow.
They let you in too, Jim.
Right.
You know, they'll let anybody in this building.
Okay, we're on the air now. Oh, here we go. I am Keith Bergman, the Littleton Town Administrator. I want to welcome everyone tonight to this special event, a presentation on Littleton's Economic Development Self-Assessment Tool report. And I'm very pleased to be able to welcome to Littleton for this presentation Professor Barry Bluestone from Northeastern University. He's the founding director of the Dukakis Center there, but even more significant to me, for all the years that I was in Provincetown as town manager, Barry was living next door in Truro. I used to call Truro as part of Greater Provincetown.
It's a suburb.
I don't think they quite cared for that description in Truro, but just before the meeting, Barry was reminding me how he was pressed into service by Truro town officials to give extra scrutiny to a proposal that I had brought to Truro to share, or for Provincetown to share Truro's transfer station with us, for solid waste transfer station. We made him a great deal, but ultimately the Truro voters passed, and it only took an act of Congress for Provincetown to solve its transfer station problem. But we're here tonight to hear a presentation on the Economic Development Self-Assessment Tool because last September the Board of Selectmen had entered into a community compact with the Baker-Polito administration where our town, as other cities and towns, got to choose the things that they wanted to work on as best practices. And we chose three. One of them was a transportation best practice with 4 of our other communities for the Crosstown Connect Transportation Management Association. Another is a strategic plan for our police and fire departments. And the third was to pursue an economic development marketing plan for which the Baker-Polito administration is providing us with Barry. That the Economic Development Self-Assessment Tool is something that has been used by many cities and towns in Massachusetts and elsewhere across the country. Our Master Plan Update Steering Committee had interviewed Catherine Tumber from the Dukakis Center last summer, I think it was, in hearing more about the Economic Development Self-Assessment Tool. And we saw that Westford had their report last fall as well, so we really wanted to pursue it here. We are kicking off. We've kicked off our master plan update, and that this tool will inform the economic development component of that update. So we're happy to have Professor Barry Bluestone here with us tonight, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Keith.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for letting me come up here today. Let me give you a little background. First, my own background. I was born in Brooklyn, New York. And in 1948, my parents moved to Detroit, Michigan. And you might think, oh my God, Detroit. Detroit in the 1950s and 60s was the richest city on the planet Earth. Had the auto industry booming, had the auto workers union, which spread the wealth. And then, of course, Detroit underwent a terrible deindustrialization. I actually wrote a book about it. And I've always been interested in this whole question of economic development. I spent time, I left Michigan, the University of Michigan, where I did my undergraduate and graduate work, came to Boston College, where I taught for 16 years, then was pulled over to UMass Boston to set up the first PhD program, turned out in public policy. And then the person who brought me over to UMass Boston from BC became president of Northeastern University, and a year later he asked if I'd come over and create a center devoted to Greater Boston and the Commonwealth, doing path-breaking research that could help communities and the Commonwealth continue to build its prosperity. And I agreed to do that, so we've now had 16 years, going on 17 years, at the Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy. Done a lot of work on housing. Every year we put out the Greater Boston Housing Report Card. You will read, I am sure, in the newspapers on June 7th, we're putting out our first Greater Boston Built Environment Infrastructure Report Card, which covers everything, every kind of transportation, Logan Airport, the Conley Terminal, Seaport, Container Port, energy, electricity, gas, water, sewer, how many people are bicycling and the bicycle paths, how many trails we have operated under DCR, the Department of Conservation and Recreation. So I'm very proud of that. But what I'm proudest of is what we're going to talk about tonight. And that is about a decade ago, 2006. Actually 2005, we got together with a group called NIOP, the National Association of Industrial and Office Properties, which is a trade association that has a lot of location and site specialists. These are people who will work for a firm to help them make a decision about where they might want to expand their operations or build a new plant or a commercial operation, a mall, whatever. And we sat down with them and said, we want to know how you think. Tell us how you think. When you're working with a client and they want to expand somewhere in Massachusetts, what are the kind of factors you take into consideration? And we held what were called focus groups, and we just let them talk and we asked questions. And based on that, we then went ahead and we did a survey of about 230 of these location specialists all over the United States. And we asked them a very set of detailed questions about all the things they would look at when they're working for a firm trying to decide where to set up a new business, private business enterprise. The upshot of that was EDSAT. We took all that information and we created an electronic survey that has 220 questions covering everything from highway access to how quick you can get a zoning variance. You'll see this in a few minutes. And we started out in 2006, 10 years ago, administering that to 12 cities in Massachusetts, not Boston, but 12 of the older industrial cities. And it turned out it worked wonders. People finally got a chance to kind of better understand the kind of factors that are important. Mayors really liked it. So we decided to expand upon that, and now we've actually had, I think Littleton is 81st community out of the 351 towns and cities in Massachusetts who have been through this exercise, and altogether about 115, because we've also done a lot in Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and scattered around the United States as far as some communities in Florida, Michigan, and the state of Washington. And what I'm going to do tonight is give you the results of this survey, which you guys filled out, and we've analyzed it. Or I should say a computer analyzed it, actually, and then we wrote up a report. So let's go back, though. I want to go back and take a look, first of all, at what our economy looks like. So let's look at the Massachusetts economy. And one of the things you see, Massachusetts is in blue, in red is the U.S., and you'll notice in most quarters, a quarter is like 3 months, Massachusetts has outperformed the U.S. economy. We didn't do that. When I first came here in 1971, Massachusetts was a disaster. Boston was horrible. But we've been doing very well, and there are times when we've outperformed extraordinarily, including the first quarter. We don't have the U.S. numbers there. But the U.S. just came in with the lowest growth rate for the first quarter of this year that we've seen in 3 years. It was like 0.7%. We were growing at 3 times that. So Massachusetts has been doing very well. And it's shown up in our employment statistics. This is the total employment in Massachusetts, statewide. And you'll see we started out at about 3.2 million back in the year 2003. We had nice growth, and then we got clobbered like everybody else during the Great Recession. 2007, 2008, 2009. And we've been pulling out of that more quickly than the rest of the country. And in fact, by 2013, we had, 3 years ago, recovered all the lost jobs. And now we were at the highest. The latest numbers I had were for last August. We've got a few newer ones. But we're at now the highest employment level in Massachusetts history. And you can see that wonderful recovery. The other thing is my colleague, Alan Clayton Matthews, who's the chief forecaster for the state of Massachusetts, and in fact was on the Council of Economic Advisors under the former governor, Governor Patrick, has projected through 2018 the growth in employment by various sectors. That top sector is professional and business services. That's expected to grow by almost 14% between 2014 and 2018. But every sector will grow, including manufacturing. There's no sector here where we see a decline in employment, which is quite staggering. So all of this looks good that way. I then went and I said, well, let's take a look at Littleton, because quite frankly, I don't know anything about you guys, right? In fact, very few people know anything about Littleton, which you may want to keep it that way. But I said, let's take a look at it, and it turns out the Massachusetts Department of Labor and Workforce Development keeps track of the number of establishments and the number of employees in every city and town based on the unemployment insurance records that are submitted quarterly by the state, by firms. And I have to tell you, I've looked at lots and lots of towns and cities. You guys look pretty good. You had in 2001 about 321 private industry establishments of all kinds. You peaked out at about 342. You lost almost nothing during the Great Recession. And then you've been growing very steadily since 2013. Now, I don't know which those companies are, because that's information Labor and Workforce Development will give me, but you may know of a few new firms that have started up in town over the last 3 years. We can convert that into average employment. Employment did decline from 2001 through 2009, a little tiny bit, but it's been growing steadily. And where you had 5,000 employees, 5,300 employees, 5,400 employees in 2001, you now have over 7,000 employees. Which is to say that you totally wasted our time, your time, and your money, or the state's money, to do this, because you don't need us. You are doing so much better than everybody else. I've done this over and over again, and you'll see later, you're also doing most of the right things. But you are doing very well. And if we look at your leading industries, you've got leading establishments of professional and technical services. Those would be doctors' offices, legal offices, accountants, and so forth. Construction is big in Littleton, as you probably know. I saw it as I came by town. Retail, trade, healthcare, etc. Good mix. And one out of 7 workers not living here, but working here in Littleton, 1 in 7 workers in retail trade. You have a lot of professional and technical workers, doctors, lawyers, nurses, social workers. You have a very strong construction industry, with 426 employees in the third quarter last year. And manufacturing. Littleton has a good bit of manufacturing, which is very strong. Okay. So that's what you look like. All right. What I want to do now is switch gears and talk a little bit about how we promote economic development, something which we've been studying now for a decade. Yes?
Is employees the only metric we use to establish what we look like?
As a town?
Yeah.
No.
Okay, because I don't think we've ever determined that as either a problem or the problem we're trying to address.
Okay, but I'm saying we do all kinds of stuff. You want us to come in, we can study your housing. We can study your infrastructure.
No, even within the economy, we have.
Right, but I'm saying we needed to take a look at what your town looked like and how it compares with other towns. And as I said at the very beginning, I stole a lot of my thunder at the lake. You're actually doing very, very well on economic development. There are a lot of towns and cities around here that are not.
Is our retail sector comparatively better than other communities?
Looks that way.
Okay.
Yeah. So all I'm saying is this is background to get us where we are. I just wanted to know a little bit more about who you are, because quite frankly, I had never heard of Littleton a year ago.
In the data you present, there's basically, it captures employment in the town.
Right.
Okay.
So we're not talking about people who live in Littleton and work outside.
Yeah, and this is one of the concerns, because if there's readily available public data showing that about 5:30 every evening, approximately 2,200 people vacate Littleton and employment of it, right?
Yeah.
And the great bulk of Littleton residents don't work here.
Yep.
Okay.
And that is true of a lot of the western suburbs here. We've done a lot of work with a group called Boroughs 5, Boroughs Plus, which are 6 communities, which is Westboro, Southboro, Northboro, Hudson, Hopkinton, and Marlborough. And they've come together around transportation and last mile transportation. But what's interesting is they have a total population of 115,000, including children. They've got 94,000 jobs. So you've got a huge number of people, like here in Littleton, who are coming here to work, right? And the major problem that you have in the Boroughs Plus neighborhoods is everybody's coming in single passenger cars, and that's why the roads are jammed, right? And the real thing is that they're close to commuter rail, but how do you get the last mile? And that's another thing that we're now starting to take a look at, is you can't tell anybody this, but we project another nearly 100,000 autos and trucks on the road in Greater Boston by 2030. Now, the average speed on I-90, for example, on Mass Pike coming in the morning is 14.7 miles per hour. I bicycle at 18, right? And I actually got out of my office, and I got here a half hour early, but once I hit Route 2, before you head off on the Union Turnpike, I was down to 7 miles an hour coming home for you guys, right? So those are issues that are really important. But we're going to focus on economic development here. So the overview is that we've studied this a long time. You may know this. It's amazing how few do, is that economic development is a collaborative process. And we learn from these experts that when they're thinking about places, they've already decided they're coming somewhere in Massachusetts. The big question is they going to go to Littleton? Are they going to go to Concord? Are they going to go to New Bedford? Or are they going to go to Worcester? Right? So the question is how does that work? Moreover, since we started doing this research, we know that there's going to be very little assistance from the state in the form of local aid. You know that already. And there's going to be no assistance from the federal government. And therefore, local economic development is going to be critical for communities, including like Littleton, particularly as your population ages, which it is, right? As is every community. And you're getting more and more people on fixed incomes. If you want to still have great public services, how are you going to fund it? And therefore, economic development becomes important, and attracting business important. What we kept hearing from our friends in this community was municipal leaders have to become the CEO for economic development. I've met a lot of mayors here. They've got elected for all kinds of crazy reasons, and often they're not elected because they're experts on economic development. So what we wanted to do was to say, okay, let's help municipal leaders, town government, city government, think about what it means to really be good at attracting the kinds of businesses you want. And we began by saying, let's assess your strengths and your weaknesses, as you would an individual or a business or anything else, okay? And then see if there are things we can change if we need to, and influence other things that may be out of our purview, right? Our fundamental proposition is cities and towns can control their own destiny, and good assessments can help do it. So as I said, we worked very closely with NIOP. We then also surveyed people from Cornet. Cornet is a trade association of in-house location experts. So I was telling Keith, my son was a superstar soccer player in high school. Played on the Bolts, played all over the United States, played in Europe. And one of the other kids on his team's father was vice president for location decisions for the Genzyme Corporation, now Sanofi. He was traveling all over the world all the time to figure out where they're going to put a new testing lab or where they're going to put a new manufacturing facility. And he was a member of Cornet Global, and we were able to survey a lot of them. Okay? We surveyed from all over the country, not just here in Massachusetts, and we surveyed people who were experts in different kinds of business. So we had a very, very good survey to base it on. And using their language, they said, what we're looking for are communities that might have some deal breakers, but communities that have taken an assessment of what their problems are, taken action, and turn those deal breakers into deal makers where they can. Okay? So, what are some of the deal breakers we heard about from these people? One is a general ignorance about market conditions, and we kept hearing these words over and over again, time to market, meaning how fast. between the time we decide to set up operations in town X and we actually get product or service out the door. And what we heard over and over again is that over time, this time to market has become more and more important. And the example I always love to use, I can't pull it out of my pocket right now, is my Apple phone, my iPhone, right? So I have an old one. It's an Apple 5, right? And now there's 6 and 6S and all that. But the fact is that, you have other companies that are putting out phones as fast as Apple does. And then you have one company that didn't, BlackBerry. And how many of you have a BlackBerry? Right? It was the only smartphone to begin with, but they were too late. And that's true of more and more firms. So getting to market fast is important. A second one is uncorrected cognitive maps. So I told you I'm from Detroit. How many of you have been to Detroit in the last 3 years? None of you? How many would have some idea of what Detroit is like? Right? And it's not a pretty picture, right? But it turns out there's some really good things going on in Detroit now, right? That we don't know about, right? And then it turns out it's not just we have uncorrected cognitive maps. I mean, like the town of the city of Chelsea, which is burned down twice. Jay Ash, the Secretary of Housing and Economic Development, was the city manager for a long time. Thank you. Chelsea is booming now. It's doing very well. But it took time for a city manager to change the image of Chelsea. Littleton's image is no one knows about you, which you may not, that's maybe perfectly what you want. But there are not too many of these location specialists who would think Littleton is where I want to go. Some communities have site deficiencies. You can think of brownfields or other problems and too little attention to those. Slow municipal processes, which can be tied to the whole question of time to market. And too much reliance on tax breaks. One of the things that we found really fascinating, because I was surprised by this, is when we talk about, well, how important is it for towns to give property tax abatements or the state to give various kinds of incentives? And virtually every one of these location specialists laughed and said, hardly important at all. I said, what do you mean by that? They said, well, first of all, if a town or city leads with a tax abatement, the first thing we hear is, oh, you want to come to town X because we're going to give you a 50% tax break on our property taxes, an abatement for 12 years. We leave town immediately because we know you must be hiding something if the first thing you're going to do is talk about a tax abatement. Will firms ask for something at the very end, like General Electric did in Boston? Of course they will. But it turns out it's a small, minor part of the decision-making process. So many other things are more important economically to the firms. So when we did the survey of NIAP, we looked at permitting processes, we looked at the labor force, the quality of the labor force, the training of the labor force, development operating costs, the business environment generally, transportation and access, quality of life, the social environment, particularly if the CEO is going to live in town. And we then converted that into 10 different sections. Access to customers and markets. Do you have good highway access? How close are you to a national or international airport? If you're looking at manufacturing, do you have rail? We looked at the concentration of business services. Do you have accounting services, legal services, and so forth? The cost of land, lease rates, and so forth. Labor. Do you have a sufficient quality of labor? Both a sufficient number and quality. We looked at municipal process. How long does it take to get through the zoning process or a building inspection, things like that. The quality of life of the community. Do you have a lot of amenities in the community? Restaurants, music, sports activities, and so forth. The quality of life on specific development sites. Is there food nearby? Are there daycare centers that employees can use? What kind of business incentives do you use? And your tax rates. And finally, access to information. Right? When we started this, almost no town had a website, 2005, 2006. And now when we've gone back and we've talked with these location specialists, what they're telling us is, like everybody else, when we want to find out about a town, we Google it. We put in Littleton, Massachusetts, and we look at your website and we try and find out as much as we can before we start wasting time going out there and really, following up. So access to information is very important. Having asked these folks, these experts, what were all these factors, we then asked them how important are they? And they said, well, there's some that are very important, there's some that are somewhat important, and then there's some that you might think are really important, but aren't very important at all. Tax breaks were one of those, by the way. And so we had an idea of not only all the things that might matter, but how much they matter, which is kind of cool. Okay? So let me take you through the results for Littleton. All right? So you did this you filled out this survey, 220 questions, and what happened is it's electronic. It went back to a secure server at Northeastern University, where we've developed a very sophisticated piece of software which takes every one of your answers in Littleton and compares it with every other town or city or a subset of town and cities that have taken this. And then it scores you. And if you look at the full report, which you'll have access to here, we use a color, a light system. Green means you're doing much better, you're doing better than average. Yellow, you're doing kind of average on that. And red means you got a problem. And then we use the moon system, which is how important is this? A full moon, this is real important, don't screw this one up. Half moon, it's somewhat important, or an empty moon, not so important. And in fact, I've sat down with mayors and they flipped through this very thick report, because you can flip through it and see this color, and all of a sudden they see green, green, and they say, wow, we're green, we're green. And I'll say, that's very nice, Madam Mayor, but no one really gives a damn about that. And here you're red, 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 and that's real important. And you begin to understand. Now again, it may, in retrospect, not be that critical for Littleton because you're doing very well. But for a town like Lynn, where we've been working, or New Bedford, or Lowell, or Lawrence, this has been a real godsend for them. They've really learned a lot from it. But you're going to learn something too. So let's take a look at the strengths that are marked as very important by our experts. Number one, you have some reasonably good highway access here in Littleton, with quite a number of sites within 2 miles of a limited access highway. You have no parking problems. You're not charging $42 an hour, as they do in the city of Boston for parking.
When you say we have no parking problems, what about access to parking?
You have no parking, you don't have a problem in terms of the price of parking, and we didn't see an access to parking as a problem. At least you didn't show us an access problem. Do you have one? Do you
Yes.
think?
Yeah.
Okay. That is not what you reported to us.
Well, you is a collective you, so
I'm saying you didn't, on the electronic survey, you did not report that.
Okay,
Okay? I didn't fill the survey out.
No, I understand.
I'm just the messenger.
right?
Okay? Traffic, traffic seems to flow pretty smoothly here. I came here during rush hour, I had no problem. I've been in a lot of other places where I'm going at 7 miles an hour. Okay? You have a very good website. Relative to other websites, you have a reasonably good website. It's updated weekly. Again, this is what you told us. All right? And it has links to planning agencies, local chambers of commerce, and other things. Okay? You have a good workforce. You have a very highly skilled workforce with a majority, a large proportion of your workforce are college educated. You have a transit-oriented development strategy. I don't know what that is. We can talk about that. Obviously a very attractive community. You've all stayed here a long time. Then there's some important factors. You have a large proportion of land that could be developed. There are some communities that have none. There are some communities, there's one community we went into that cannot have any businesses over 12,000 square feet. And the reason is they never linked into the Quabbin Reservoir. They have a real water problem, and because they have a water supply problem, they don't have enough pressure for sprinkler systems. And in the state of Massachusetts, you must have a sprinkler system on any commercial building over 12,000 square feet. So they're out of business for a decision they made in the 1950s. right? You have some pretty good complementary business services. You've done some cross-marketing between the community and the Chamber of Commerce. You've done some marketing follow-up about firms that have come here and asked them, you know, has this worked out for you? Which is good for your kind of advertising. And you have a way of developers can come in and do a checklist of permitting, okay? You do some fast-track permitting for some potential developers in the Point, this commercial complex that you have here. You have some very good available space. There's some communities, again, that have very little available space, or the space, unfortunately, is a brownfield site or a grayfield site that needs a lot of remediation. And you have a lot of the kind of normal amenities you would hope to have around development sites. Your labor cost is a little bit higher, but not much higher than comparable group means, CGMs. Crime rates are low, extremely low, and you have extremely good schools in terms of percentage of your students who are going on to college, the percentage of students who are dropping out, and so forth. This is what we learned from your answers, but again, it's not absolute, it's relative to all the other communities that might be trying to get the same business as you are. Okay? You engage local business persons to represent the town to help attract new business, and as I said, you have available sites. You also happen to be in Massachusetts, which is very good because Massachusetts has a lot of incentives that they give out to firms. Investment tax credits, workforce development tax credits. Mass development has all kinds of money. We have money from the Mass Life Sciences Center. One of the things that we've been talking about with communities is having them help firms that might want to come here, particularly from out of state, access those state resources. And we're getting some mayors and we're getting some community officials to say, we will make introductions for you. We'll even have somebody on our staff help fill out some of the forms so you could apply, let's say, for a workforce development grant to help pay for some of your training. It's good stuff. Has a number of cultural and recreational amenities, and you have a community which seems to have helped expedite the development process more so than other communities where you sometimes have fairly verbal and vocal community reaction to any new development, and you don't have somebody mediating that discussion within town. Okay? You don't have, you possess some commuter rail fairly close by, which is very good too. But you have a few weaknesses, okay? One is timeliness of approvals. Again, this is not me, this is what we hear, and that is that it takes a little bit longer here than in the comparable group communities to get through zoning variances, if you need one, to get some of your businesses done. And because of that important time to market, more and more of these site specialists and location specialists want communities that will, as one person put it, we'd certainly rather have a quick no than a slow yes. Because if we get a quick no, we can say, fine, you don't want this, we'll go somewhere else. But a slow yes really is painful and expensive. So having a process which is, we have some communities, for example, now, based on what they've done here, they allow now a single presentation before all boards of a development plan. So you can present before the environmental committee, the zoning committee, building inspector, everything. Every committee still has a separate vote, but instead of having to do 6, 8, in some cases 12 separate presentations, it's a signal that the town is interested in your business. Your rents are somewhat higher than some of the communities around here, which is something. Public sewer and wastewater treatment is a problem. So for those kinds of firms that use a great deal of water or a great deal of sewage, this would be a problem. Framingham, for example, has a Genzyme factory now because the state actually funded a water treatment center for Framingham, which allowed them to attract a Genzyme biotech firm. Okay? You don't have a particular overall industrial attraction policy. I mean, in Boston, we'll attract anything that has biotech in it. We went after General Electric, and we got General Electric. Cambridge, of course, Kendall Square is all about that. Leominster is plastics, that kind of stuff. And your price of your housing, of course, is somewhat higher than it is in other communities. It's a minor factor, it's not a real important factor. Obviously, the closest airport is Logan for international flights, and for most domestic flights, it takes a little while to get there. I live part of the year in Cambridge, and early in the morning, if I skip traffic, I can get there in 14 minutes. It takes you a little longer to get to Logan Airport. For companies that are dependent on travel, that can be a factor. Okay. But that's what you look like. But then 2 years ago, I was on sabbatical, and I got invited to spend a year at the Boston Federal Reserve Bank. And I wasn't setting international interest rates. I was working in their community affairs department, and they had identified 20 working cities throughout Massachusetts. They call them working cities. And these were cities not like Littleton. They're cities, first of all, not towns. And they're ones that had median family incomes lower than the average in the state and a poverty rate higher. So they're Lawrences, Lowells, New Bedfords, Lynn's, Worcester, Springfield, and so forth. And they said, you know, we'd like you to use your EDSAT data to see if you can find out what works. Not what in theory works, what actually works. So what I did is I started with the 20 working cities, and I collected, all 20 had gone through EDSAT, which is cool. And I collected that data from the AS202s, those insurance forms, on the number of establishments and the growth between, I think it was 2001 and 2013, because I did this 2 years ago, and employment growth. And I said, okay, we know how these towns and these 20 cities score on the EDSAT, and we know how well they did in employment. Is there any correlation? Is there any correlation? So what I did is I looked at employment trends, and it may be too difficult to see this, but what I have up there is the growth in employment, or the change in employment between 2001 and the second quarter of 2013. That's the summer of 2013, and I started doing this work in late 14, in mid 14. First of all, what's interesting, if you can see it all the way over on the right side, I have the growth in employment between 2001 and 2013 in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts statewide. It's less than 1%. And if you go back and you look at that second chart I had, we were growing, then we fell dramatically during the recession, and then we were coming back. And by 2013, we had just gotten back to what we had lost statewide. But we found there were some communities that were doing much better than the state. And fascinating, Chelsea was number one. No one believed that. Chelsea, it burned down in the 1970s. And that was the second time it's burned down in 100 years. Second was Haverhill. And by the way, both of those grew, Chelsea grew by more than 10%, and Haverhill was up around 9% growth. The state grew by less than 1% in employment. And the others were Lawrence and Brockton. At the other end, we found some communities that had real disasters. The biggest one being Malden. Malden lost 27% of its employment between 01 and 13. Now, part of it is they lost one big hospital, but they lost a lot of others. Fall River didn't do very well. New Bedford wasn't great. Chicopee, right? From the point of view, though, of a statistician, this is great, because I have what is called variance. I got some real highs, I got some real lows. If they were all the same, there'd be nothing to explain. So what I want to know is, why is Chelsea doing so well, or towns and cities, or cities like Chelsea, and why are the Fall Rivers and Maldens doing so poorly? And has any of that correlated with anything we know about the cities from their EDSATs? Pretty neat problem, okay? So I did a correlation analysis, and what I did is there are 220 questions that you answered, and all these others answered, and I turned them into 26 measures. So for instance, there are 4 or 5 questions about highways. I made one factor out of that, or one measure. I had a bunch of questions about traffic congestion. I combined those. So, because I'm not going to study 220 things, so I made these measures. So, there's a measure of highway access, there's a measure of parking, there's a measure of labor skills, there's a measure of marketing follow-up, and so forth. And then I said, is there a correlation between any of these 26 measures and the success or failure in growing your economy? Okay? It turned out, maybe not surprisingly, that the very highest correlation was that those communities that had a lot of available development sites did a lot better at attracting businesses. Not surprising. If you don't have any sites, you're not going to get any business. The second was those communities that had better site amenities. Daycare centers, restaurants, things like that. The third was how well the city did in its economic development marketing. Did the city work with its Chamber of Commerce? Did they have a website that was really friendly in terms of giving information about the city and town and how you go through economic development? That turned out to be the third most important out of 26 factors. The fourth was timeliness of approvals. Again, how quick can you get those approvals through? Do you have parking? It's both available and at a price that people can afford. And the last was just barely significant with school success. Those communities that had somewhat better high school graduation rates and lower dropout rates did a little bit better. But having sites, having some amenities near those sites, and timeliness of approval, and an economic development marketing turned out to be the four most important factors. I didn't know that before I did this. No one did. Okay? I also put in some control variables. I said, how important is it to be close to Boston? So using some mapping, electronic mapping, we did the distance by road to Logan Airport. Okay? It turns out not to be that important. Slightly positive. If you're closer to Boston, you do a little bit better, but not a whole lot better. Or put another way, it would be better if you were closer to Logan Airport, but it's not a killer. The second one was we thought, well, the communities that are poorer are going to have more trouble attracting business. No. If anything, there's a slight positive correlation between the poverty of a community or its median family income. And that's why Chelsea, Lawrence, Brockton are so high. And finally, we wanted to know about the manufacturing base. And when we did this earlier, we found out there was a negative correlation. If you had a big manufacturing base at one point, you were now in trouble because you were dubbed as Detroit. Now manufacturing's coming back. In fact, we've done 2 major studies. Manufacturing's a positive. And so those are the things we found. But even more interesting were some of the things that we thought would be important that weren't. So for instance, we thought it would be really important that you have legal, law firms and accounting firms and so forth in town. Turns out it's practically zero correlation. And it turns out the answer is, if we need a lawyer who's a specialist in something, we can go next door. Or we can go into Boston, right? We thought low crime rates made a difference. You have a very low crime rate, but that's not what's going to attract people. Public transit we thought might be real important. I wish it were. It's not. Highway access we thought would be really important. It turns out almost all these communities have fairly good highway access, unlike being in the middle of Montana. Right? Rents I thought would be very important. No correlation. Cultural and recreational amenities I thought would be really important. That you have a sports team like the Lowell Spinners, or you have theater like Lynn has. Not very important. Tax rates turned out to be negatively correlated. That blew my mind. I thought, how can that be? Why would it be that communities that had somewhat higher tax rates actually did better at attracting business? So I went back and I asked our experts, and they said, why are you surprised? I said, well, because you guys hate taxes. He says, we don't hate taxes. For most of us, except for the small little businesses, taxes aren't that important, local taxes. We worry about corporation taxes and all that. But we do worry about the nature of services, and those communities that have real low tax rates often have lousy services. And we need communities with good services. So it turns out that, taxes are not a critical problem, despite the fact that I thought they would be, and many of you probably thought they were. And we thought physical attractiveness of the city would be really important, but Chelsea and Lawrence aren't the most attractive cities, and yet they do. I then said, let's expand it. So I went beyond these older industrial cities, and I was then able to do it for 50 manufacturing cities, which include a lot of communities like Littleton. And what we found, which really stunned us, so now we're talking about a bigger array of towns and cities, including more affluent ones like Littleton, is the number one correlation was with economic development marketing. Those communities that have done a better job of making a name for themselves, a positive name for themselves, will get the attention of these site developers and firms. Let me give you an example, not from development. So I teach at Northeastern University. You may not know it, but Northeastern University gets more applications for our freshman class than any other private school in the nation. Last semester we had 52,000 apply for 2,800 slots. Okay? 52,000 kids applied for 2,800 freshman slots. And I'm thinking, how the hell do we go through 52,000 applications? So I call my friend Philly Mentella. Philly is the Senior Vice President for Enrollment Management. I asked her this question. She said, well, Barry, we actually hire scores of temps to go through these applications. And we train them, and many we have year after year. But they do the first cut, and all they do is decide whether this application goes into the discard pile, or for further consideration. And if you get in the discard pile, you're gone. Okay? Now, how many of you have had kids who've gone to college? How many of you helped the kids prepare for their college applications? Okay, I did. And you know, SAT scores and grade points and essay and all that. What's the average amount of time that one of these temps takes on one application?
10 seconds.
What?
10 seconds.
No.
3 minutes.
6 minutes.
6 minutes. Yeah.
Okay? What do? They look at your SAT score, they look at your high school rank, and they read the first paragraph of your essay. So if you don't nail it in the first paragraph, even though your second paragraph would win a Nobel Prize, you're gone. And that makes me understand how important marketing is. Because many of these site specialists are looking at 20 or 30 communities when they're thinking about a firm that's come to see them. And the question is, what's the first impression, and do you get a second look? Good economic development marketing turns out to be really important. Blew me away. There's very little of this in the literature. Second is timeliness of approvals, right? Again, that comes up, this time to market thing. The third was available parking. Public transit turns out now to be important for this. Cross-marketing turns out to be important. That's where the city or town works with the private sector to market together. Low traffic congestion. Fast-track permitting, where you might have an area of the city where you can get fast-track. And, of course, site availability comes in there, too. But the top three are economic development marketing, timeliness of approvals, parking. Okay? How does Littleton do? Turns out you do really well, right? You have a reasonably good economic development marketing. You told us you have reasonably good parking.
Well, based on what reasonable economic development marketing?
Well, relative to other websites, your website looks very good. You seem to, we understand that you work with the business community in terms of marketing the community. I don't know if that's the chamber or whatever.
We don't have a chamber. And,
Well, a business group, is there a business group? Or one in the region that you work with?
Melissa would take.
we don't have a local chamber.
Well,
Okay.
most towns don't.
Okay.
Pardon?
Most towns don't have their.
No,
own.
no, no. I mean, we've been working with Metro West, for instance, Chamber of Commerce. Bonnie Bianchi was running that for a long time and did a phenomenal job for each of the Metro West communities. But we have other communities we went into who've never talked to a business leader ever. You apparently do. Again, this is not me. This is you responding.
Well, who were the respondents? How many respondents did you have?
You weren't there.
How many respondents? It was an online.
No, it was not.
Difficult years, there was very few folks showed up.
Okay.
The results are online. The document was prepared first cut was by staff, and then we had,
3-hour meeting
We
at
had-
the police station.
No, I understand that.
But there were hardly, it hardly represented the town in the
Yeah,
sense that you
yeah.
need.
Right.
Really, it was,
Well, I mean-
it was not, and I think you'd agree, it did not comprise.
I mean, some of these conclusions look an awful lot like what the Economic Development Committee presented a year ago to the selectmen. I mean, that's no, you wouldn't, you know.
I wouldn't know that.
You would know that, but,
Right?
you know.
and the
Well,
Economic
Paul,
Development
that
Committee
correlation
was
exists,
well.
that's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, it is,
Yeah.
because we haven't done anything on it.
Well, all I can tell you, and again, I have not seen yet, in the last 3 years, a city or town in Massachusetts that we've been in that has had the same record of employment growth that you have.
But again, that's the metric you use. If our concern going into economic development, as has been at least established locally, is for revenue growth and for services that the community is not currently seeing, employment has never been vocalized as a primary concern. So using that as a consistent metric as to how we're doing doesn't really
Well, the
get to it.
reason why we use employment or establishments, I've done the same thing on the number of establishments growth, is that usually communities with more establishments have a better tax base in terms of revenue from business community than a community that's losing businesses. And I can show you that in the data. So if you have more establishments coming into town, you can have a more diverse tax base. Right?
Oh, that's fine.
but I think.
I'll remember that when I, talk to folks who say, why don't we have this, why don't we have that? It's like, well, we have X number of establishments, 10 of them might be banks and, and 0
paying
of them.
taxes?
What's
Are
that?
they paying taxes?
Yeah, but they're not providing a variety of services. I mean, in that one case, yes. I mean,
Okay.
and again, there's no.
So what do you
there's no
want? You
food.
want more restaurants?
Yeah.
What do you want?
I think part.
What
Yes,
services?
Amongst other things.
Tell me
sure,
some of the
sure.
others.
Well, this shouldn't be coming out in the dialogue at this point. I mean,
Why not?
Because the survey has already been done, has it not?
Yeah,
Okay.
but I'm saying, this is the beginning of a process.
Well, no, because we've been at this process for many years, so this is not really the beginning.
This is another piece of the process.
Right, right.
It's not going to give you all the answers.
I
you know.
understand that.
It's hardly cost anything to do for you guys.
Right.
Okay?
Except
So the
time.
question, what?
Nothing, that's fine.
Do you think this is a waste of time?
No.
No, honest.
No.
Do you think it's a waste of time?
I think I'd like to see more in terms of concrete steps, because we've had specific requests on the table for quite some time.
Okay, well, let's see what we found out,
Right.
okay? So I've never seen any other town have 7 stars. The most I've seen is 4. So you are such an outlier on these. Again, based on the results from your survey, comparing it with all the other communities that have done the survey. Okay? And the one place where you seem to not do quite as well is timeliness of approvals. Other communities seem to be doing a little bit better on that. Okay? So what are our conclusions? Things to think about. Littleton has some really good things going for it. Plan reviews, you had, you could do a little bit better on time to market. Your town should craft a more aggressive commercial and industrial policy to attract the kind of services or businesses you want. But you have relatively low traffic congestion. You have a significant amount of land that businesses could settle on here. You have a well-educated and skilled workforce, a well-designed website relative to other communities. Those are all good things you have going for you that you can take advantage of it. We think you could do a little bit more to streamline your permitting process. There's not much you could do to reduce rents. You might want to think about if there's anything you can do to improve your water system and your sewer system, and whether that infrastructure investment would be worth making. That's a more expensive one than doing anything else, but for some communities, that's a real constraint. And it's going to be a bigger constraint as you go out toward 2030, as we've just seen in the study that will come out June 7th. So that's what we found, right? This is not, this is a minor piece of work. We put a lot of time into it, but it's still just one piece of work that you might want to consider as you think about your master plan as you think about going forward in terms of economic development. And you can take the answers or not. But it is a reflection of what we learned from the study. If you have strong disagreements with what we found here, then we should ask the question, is the information that we had from EDSAT incorrect? That this paints too rosy a picture? Or we had lots of people in community saying, oh, we're not that bad. And I said, well, then why did you lose so many establishments and jobs over the last 5 years? So that's what I'm thinking of.
Leaving out whether or not our economic development program and the website is up to snuff. I happen to be one of the minority who thinks they're not. Leaving all that aside, let me switch it around and ask the following. Based on what you saw, let's downgrade those two components, that just for sake of grid, all right? What kinds of companies, and you can, broadly speaking, and if you were to say manufacturing, yes, I do want to know what you mean by that. What kind of companies would find that profile attractive?
A lot. And the reason is, the things that companies are most concerned about now, and we've done this with many firms and we're now expanding into other firms. Number one, what hurts us in Massachusetts are high energy costs. And that's why we don't do as well as some other states. But what we offset that with, and it's become the most important factor for businesses, is the workforce. Because we have a very, very powerful workforce here. The other thing that I think is going to happen here is that while your lease rates and rent rates are somewhat higher than the rest of the community, they're nothing close to the core. I mean, you cannot afford Kendall Square. No one can. Even some of the biggest firms are finding that difficult. I have projected that over the next decade to 2 decades, you're going to see more firms trying to move further away to communities where you have a good workforce, good labor force, where people can get to work reasonably easily, where there are good school systems, very important, and where there is available land. And that's why Framingham was able to attract Genzyme with a bunch of jobs. And now you're finding even biotech firms, as you see, and I was just with Travis McCready, who's the head of the state's Mass Life Sciences Center. You're finding more and more of these firms, once they get into a point where they have a product that they want to manufacture or service, they want to get out of Kendall Square. They want to get to someplace cheaper. I think more and more firms are going to be looking for the area between 128 and 495 in the future. And part of it is that just getting into the city no longer works for their employees. It's impossible. So I think there's a fabulous opportunities for this whole ring of communities that are run kind of outside of 128 for future business. The other thing, too, is to the extent that firms want their employees not having to spend an hour and a half or 2 hours commuting each way, is they're looking for communities that have more reasonable priced housing than we have in Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, where the prices are going through the roof. If you saw the Globe yesterday, quoted on the front page, that we just don't have middle income housing anymore in most of the city. We still have some of that out in here in communities out here, and that's another thing that is a good selling point. Plus, my impression is you have very good school here. That's really important increasingly for the firms that have, are relying on a very highly skilled workforce.
I think,
That's what I'm just guessing, based on what I know, and that's why I think you've done reasonably well, because you have many good things going for you in terms of what firms are looking for.
and I think you can break it down into 3 sections in town, right? What we just saw, the point, right? We have an overlay district, the permitting went well and fast, track, it was successful. Downtown, right? We have nothing going on. Sewage is a major component of that. You look it up at Taylor Street, nothing going on, a lot of vacant buildings. Why? There's no amenities around. So you take those 3 sections of town, and they kind of fit right into what we just heard.
But they fit in what we've heard for years.
Understood, so
No, they
now we
don't.
gotta act upon what we just heard. I mean, this kinda, validates the concerns we've been hearing for years. We have an outside source coming in saying, we have some issues. And we can point to, you know, the three sections in town, success, needs help, and we really don't have anything. The Point, downtown, and Upper Taylor Street. I mean, if, you know, we can take this and actually get some type of, look at Matt, we all know some zonings needs to be fixed and changed, and maybe another overlay, and sewering is gonna help the downtown area.
The issue that we had, the area where the Point is located, the 90-acre commercial development at exit 31 and 495, right across there, right across 495, is our single largest employer, IBM, with its largest software development campus in North America, which chose Littleton in 2007 for a number of reasons, including the fact that we had commuter rail. They had high hopes that the commuter rail schedule might be good enough to actually get their employees here, or, you know, at work on time, who come in from Cambridge and Boston. But only recently, in fact, it's a week from Monday, that the MBTA will actually have an arrival from Boston that gets to Littleton at 7:09 in the morning. A couple of years, when IBM chose to come here, 9:40 was the earliest the reverse commute arrived here. Right now it's 7:33, which is pretty good. I was intrigued to hear that you're working with the Marlboro and some of those communities on last mile issues. That is, I would have to say, our number one transportation issue right now. The MBTA has given us the Fitchburg line schedule that we've craved. We are working with our neighbors, Westford, Red Hat, and Juniper, with Boxborough, Cisco Systems, and we have Devon's, Bristol-Myers Squibb, a number of major employers in the area, all of whom would benefit from being able to get your employees from the commuter rail station to their final destination, and we don't, and that's our...
Yeah, well, what's interesting is we're hoping to launch a new research program with Burroughs Plus, where we're going to be looking at a public-private partnership that would go all the way from RTA buses at one end to private van service from the Bristol-Myers Squibb, like we have the LMA hospital stuff in Boston. But we also are talking with Uber and Bridge and Lyft about how their services might work. And here's the problem. To allocate drivers and equipment to serve just during commuting hours is not a winning proposition for any of these guys. But one of the things we've been pointing out to them is that many of these communities have lots of people coming in, and at the same time they have lots of current residents who are aging in place. And so the question would be, as we get to a point, I'm one of them at age 71, that's how old I am, and thinking less and less about wanting to drive, or even more importantly, you don't want me driving. To what extent can we create a system where you use these kinds of transit for commuting during the 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock and 3 to 6, but have it available during the day and after 6 for a growing aging population? So, you know, I can get to the mall, I can get to the movies, I can do this without having to get into my own car, and quite frankly, risk my own life and that of other people.
Yeah. We should swap stories afterwards, because the 5 communities that Littleton is part of, the Crosstown Connect Transportation Management Association, it's a combination of our 5 municipalities and the major employers in the area. So we actually have at the table the IBMs and the Red Hats and
I'd love to come out and talk with
Junipers
you.
making those decisions. We're the idea was to get together so we can make the smartest transportation decisions. Juniper runs shuttles from Westford down to Alewife.
Uh-huh.
They want to run the shuttles from Westford to Littleton Station once the schedule is conducive.
Yeah.
And we're working, we have fleets of town-owned shuttles that aren't doing anything before 8 o'clock in the morning. There's a whole combination of things that might be put together, and so
Well, I'd love to talk with you
Yeah.
more about that, and I'd like to get you together with the people in Burroughs Plus.
Yeah.
I think that would
Look
be a
forward to that.
valuable
Thank you.
discussion. Any other questions? Thoughts?
Just one last thing on the metric, because the metric of jobs from the employer and the global standpoint is one thing. The metric, though, that we look at when we say why we do economic development, as Paul suggested, is totally different. It's that what sort of development can we get that is a net benefit to the tax base that gives us more money to spend on services that we need. That's the challenge that we're knocking up against right now. And it's the reason why we don't like residential, why we do like certain other commercial uses, so that we can actually see from our economic development efforts a net increase in the local funds that we have to spend on needed services.
Well, for many communities, the major reason they wanted us to come in is for precisely that same reason. How do we build up our commercial tax base to support the services, particularly as our population ages and we don't want to do overrides and tax the hell out of our residents?
But it also comes down, I think, to one of your last slides was the marketing of the town. Having a marketing plan, and I think that's where we're desperately lacking also. To get the types of businesses in, let them know who we are and what we want.
Yeah.
Right,
I think that's
right
where-
now, we do more catching than we do pitching. I think that we've had a number of companies that have come here. I'm not sure if IBM happened before I got here. I have to say, I took this job here because I chose to work here when I was offered the job because IBM had chosen Littleton a few months before, and I thought, what a great place to be, and that there was a huge amount of work that had been done locally, including town meeting declaring that site for IBM would have a TIF, would have a tax increment financing plan. Happy to hear we don't need to do those, but we've had a number of large businesses that have chosen to site here because we were on the TIF radar screen anyway.
Right.
So,
Exactly.
but it needs to be a lot more proactive and have a mission. I'm often asked, why don't we do biotech here? Well, we don't have a sewer, so we can't play
Yeah.
without a sewer. We've looked at a sewer specifically for economic development,
Uh-huh.
and when we
Well, we didn't look
We
at
need
it
to look at it.
specifically for economic development. In fact, that was part of the reason we had opposition. It was viewed as specifically economic development when they were actually.
Yeah, it was only for commercial property, so, yeah.
But you're all on
Commercial properties
Title
in-
V?
Yeah.
in an area where where the water was being set into private septic systems as opposed to being sent back to the aquifer. So there's an environment.
Yeah, there were
Don't lose sight of the
environmental
environmental component.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to circle back to a question my husband asked, which is what kinds of businesses are attracted to this matrix? And your answer was lots, but that doesn't flesh it out.
Yeah, I think, the number one, again, I'm looking from outside in. The number one thing that I were a business now, and I were looking at communities, the thing that I would be very excited about is the quality of your workforce. And that is becoming so very important. So that the kind of businesses that I think Littleton can attract are going to be high value-added businesses that use a significant amount of higher skilled, higher educated workers. Some of that, by the way, believe it or not, is in advanced manufacturing, biotech, for instance. Not producing huge amounts of drugs, but producing research. I think there's still an opportunity for expanding manufacturing beyond that. Lemonster has done very well on plastics, but plastics have become critical in everything. Just go into a hospital. It's all plastic. You've got all kinds of professional services that can be supported by this kind of community. Some of it is in the health field, which is growing, faster than any other field in the country. We've gone from 4% of gross domestic product to 18, and we'll be up at 22% in the next 5 years of GDP. $1 out of $5 spent in the United States is on some form of healthcare now. So those are the kinds of things that might be, that Littleton would be attractive to those kinds of firms.
You found the worth in targeting, say, we have IBM's largest, computer lab and everything in the Commonwealth here, or actually in North America. Sitting down and really trying to get a partnership with them and say, not just their expansion, but I mean, there's plenty of feeder companies that
That's right.
that feed into IBM and say, hey, can you assist us in getting some of those to come this way?
I think that's exactly the right thing. We call that cross-marketing, but that's really important because software is just going to continue to grow, and IBM has one big share of it, but there are many other companies who have huge shares of it. And knowing that IBM came here and that they're happy being here is a real draw. I mean, if IBM's happy, if they're unhappy with this decision, then you probably don't want to market that. But if they've been happy with that decision and they think this has been a good place, telling that story is really critical for other firms. And we're probably after bioscience, because of MIT, Harvard, MIT, Northeastern, BU, and others. We're a leader in the nation in all forms of high-tech, mainly software design. We're now doing more and more in animation. We're doing more and more in robots. My sister-in-law is the CFO of Boston Dynamics, which is a huge, a big robot manufacturer that was, robot designer, was bought by Google, and Google's just spun them off again. We've got Boston Dynamics, we've got iRobot, we've got a lot of these companies that are going to be growing and expanding, and there's no reason why Littleton shouldn't have a shot at attracting some of them here.
Well, I think the IBM story is also, they came and they didn't have a lot of amenities in the community, and something they stressed was, can you assist in that? We'd like a hotel close by, we'd like these restaurants, and the town stepped up and did the overlay district, and the Point came to town with, when the town is done, we'll have a 10-screen cinema, a hotel, and 7 restaurants and shopping and everything else that's.
Hotel opened yesterday.
Right, and that, is literally, half a mile away from IBM. And I think it's a story that can be told that, shows Littleton is.
As I think I said at the very beginning of my talk, and I've done this 70 times in the last 3 years, I have not seen another community having more going for it positively than Littleton.
Your correlation analysis is very useful, but I think what we're going to have to do when we do our own homework here now in town as we go forward with the various committees that are dedicated to economic development, excuse me, is that we look at those pluses that you mentioned, but some of the negatives, the areas needing improvement, how much do they offset those higher quality areas, if you will, and thus it becomes a net negative versus a net positive. That's what will be useful for us going forward. And that we've heard some of this before, and sometimes, some of us need it 10 times. What is it, Paul, in politics, you got to have 7 contacts before someone remembers the politician's name, something like that. So maybe this is our 7th time. Maybe we'll start to remember some of this stuff going forward. So it's what we found that isn't so good here in Littleton, to look at, when we start talking about the businesses we want to take into town, we don't want smokestacks. We already know that. That's the easy answer. But you mentioned, biotech. Well, biotech, a lot of people think that's good. But if it's not going to come here because we don't have proper sewage infrastructure to support something like that, if biotech is something we want, well, what do we need to do to the infrastructure? So that's how we use this, I believe. Not whether or not we agree with all the concepts that were presented and what our neighbors and our friends and family members may have answered to these particular questions. Well, have relevance, but it's not something to fall on our swords over. So as we go forward, let's look at some of the things that we agree with. If we don't agree with, where do we need to change to make you agree with it?
Yeah. The nice thing about software design it uses almost no water, therefore uses almost no sewage. So, there are other communities where biotech manufacturing, like Framingham, can make it big. That's probably not you, right? Unless you're willing to put in a lot of funds and get the state to put in some Mass Works funds as well to hook you up to the to the aqueducts, to the sewage and out toward Deer Island. But I would think that in answering your question, the industries that require a highly sophisticated labor force, software design is one of them. Some forms of manufacturing that are in the high end that don't use a lot of water, but they use electricity, natural gas. These are the ones that I think would probably work here that are high value added, high tax revenue firms. And I would say, given what I've learned very briefly about you guys, if companies know about you, they would look at you closely. They won't put you immediately in the discard file.
And the other thing, following up on what Paul said, is we want to act on it sooner than later, so we're not sitting here 2 or 3 years down the road saying, we just did this, and we just did it again.
Time to market.
Yeah.
Time to market works at the municipal level as well. I mean, I'm in Cambridge part of the year. And we are just lucky because we've got MIT and Harvard. If we didn't have that, Cambridge would be a disaster because it does nothing right, right? Its housing costs is off the charts, right? Median price of a house is now over $1 million in Cambridge. We've got, the Socialist Republic of Cambridge. You can't get anything through it. But, fortunately, MIT and Harvard offset that, and people want to be near what is the smartest people on the planet Earth, all of whom live within a mile or work within a mile of Kendall Square. And so people, these firms are willing to spend a gargantuan amount of money per square foot for space because they want lunch with MIT graduates. You don't have MIT here. You got some other great things. But I can tell you that economic development in Cambridge is in trouble. I'll be the first. I mean, if you look at it, it looks like it's the greatest place you can possibly be. It can't continue. The housing isn't there, and the commercial property rates are just out of sight. And, Vertex leaves and goes to South Boston, and we're finding more and more of these biotech firms, once they're up and running and they realize they don't have to be right on top of Harvard and MIT, are starting to say, where can I go where we've got the good workforce, or the workforce can get to us, my taxes are lower, my lease rates are lower, and I've got a good community for my kids to go to school.
Well, this is also useful for us, and the timeliness is somewhat, I think, all people in the room and other folks in town take credit for working on the timeliness of this, and thank you, Keith, for bringing a lot of this together. Is we're in the master plan update process right now, and as you know, this is one of the pillars of it. So the challenge actually is going forward is not producing a master plan, it's producing an actionable master plan that we actually act upon. And that's what we're working towards right now. In fact, I know we're on TV, tomorrow night is a meeting here, right in this room, folks. So please join us. We'll have our consultants there, 7 p.m.
I'm going to follow up with something further. Littleton itself does not have the workforce that fits the profile that you were starting to describe, because the workforce comes in to do the IBM is now a service company, which it wasn't when it first arrived here. It's no longer.
No, they
its
don't
main
make
research.
anything,
Its
right.
main research is elsewhere, and it makes practically nothing. It's no longer in that, and it doesn't even make softwares, technically speaking. All right, but in any event, if we look for companies that are looking for very smart, skilled people, those people are currently living or trying to live, I'll say, broadly speaking, inside of 128, and they're unable to afford it. So it seems like anything that we do that makes Littleton more attractive or easier to get to or to live closer to or actually live in, any one of those, coupled with whatever we can do to make ourselves more attractive to either service firms or firms basically that are softer on our need for a sewage system, may be more helpful.
Yeah. Well, I can hear in the room that some of you do not want to see more housing. But my argument would be, because I do a lot of work on housing, that there are two reasons why you might want to rethink that. Number one, like every other community in Massachusetts, we're getting older, and you're going to have people who want to downsize, and they want to stay in the community, and they're not moving to Boston. And yet, you may not have sufficient housing for people who live here already who want to live in something smaller or in something with multi-unit. The other is that you're going to find increasingly, and I have members of my own staff who have chosen to move away from Boston to get into housing they can afford. These are PhDs. So for example, my associate director lives in North Reading. She commutes in from North Reading because they have 3 kids. And they can't put them in private school. So Boston and Cambridge and Somerville are out of the question for them. They're very smart kids. And so she puts up with this horrendous commute. But, there's another possibility, and that is she's looking at moving from Northeastern to teach in Lowell, at UMass Lowell. Because she'd be closer to work and wouldn't have that horrendous commute. So I'm working hard to try and keep her. Told her she could use my house. I don't want to lose her. But I think housing is going to be part of this whole issue as well. And I've been actually telling a lot of communities you should be a little less reticent about more housing if it's appropriate for the new demographic. In fact, this morning I had a group of architects from Portugal, from Lisbon, and I was talking about the third demographic revolution in Greater Boston. The first demographic revolution was between 1870 and 1920. Littleton hardly existed, but Boston's population triples in 50 years, from 250,000 to 750,000. Almost all of that immigrant, Irish, Italian, Russian, and so forth. We build triple-deckers to house them. We house all of them by developing a housing that was appropriate to immigrant labor. The second demographic revolution, of course, was the one that Littleton was involved in, and that's after World War II, people returning, leaving the cities, going to the suburbs. Burlington population in 30 years increases by a power of 10, from 2,300 to 23,000 in 30 years. And you have that demographic, and what do? We built the housing you'll see all through Littleton and Burlington and others, the suburban tract home on a half-acre lots. And that revolution's over. And the new revolution, if you look at the data, is overwhelmingly millennials as they get older, so the 25 to 44-year-olds, and the plus 65s. And we haven't built any housing for any of those groups. So in the city, I've been working with the state senate, and I've been working with the mayor, Mayor Walsh, and I've been working with Governor Baker on creating in the city what I'm calling millennial villages, housing specifically for millennials, graduate students, medicals, residents, interns, other young professionals. Multi-unit housing, but I want to get them out of the old triple-deckers because they've just destroyed that market for working families. And I know we can't build a lot of middle income when working income family housing because the cost per square foot is just outrageous now. So we got to think of some new ways to do that. Anything else? Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed this.
Appreciate it a lot, and I had neglected to mention that one of the main reasons why we're doing economic development marketing plan is not only because it was in the community compact, but it started out, it was one of the goals, and it's consistently been a goal that's been established by the Board of Selectmen each year. And so when we went to the Commonwealth and said, help us with a marketing plan, their first line of defense was EDSAT. Have you done the EDSAT? No. Well, then you need to do the EDSAT as your baseline. We have continued to work with the Commonwealth and have found we get excellent service from the Baker Polito administration. Our main economic development engine that we've been working on, frankly, is transportation. That whole last mile reverse commute issue. But I think that as we move forward with the Economic Development Marketing Plan, that we're going to continue to seek whatever help we can get from state government, who's been very helpful to us. So thanks, everyone, for
Thank you.
coming
Thank you
out
for
tonight.
coming out
And
tonight.
thanks again, Barry Bluestone, for your report. Thank you.
Thank you.